So hi everyone, my name is Ellie Young. Today I'm going to be sharing the research I did for my undergraduate honors thesis for political science. It's titled The People to Prisoners Pipeline, Structural Differences in the United States and Norway Influencing Incarceration and Recidivism. I'd like to just start out with my acknowledgements by thanking both of my advisors, Dr. Allison Gash and Dr. Kristen Bell, without whom I would have been totally lost. These incredibly talented and insightful and also very, very busy women shared their time and their wisdom with me, and I'm just so grateful. So a little background, I decided to write my thesis on incarceration because throughout my college career, I've had the opportunity to take classes and write papers exploring the roots of deviant behavior, as well as intervention and prevention techniques that are currently being used. I became really fascinated with why the US had such high levels of incarceration, while comparably developed countries did not. Recidivism, which is the rate at which people are rearrested after release, is the highest in the world in the US, and I really just wanted to understand why. So I'll start out with some goals that I had. My research had three main goals. First, I wanted to understand similarities and differences between the US and Norway. I did this by exploring the history as well as their current legislation and practices and the way their society works right now. Through exploring their history, I was able to identify some different possible reasons for the way they approach incarceration as opposed to the US. Second, I wanted to flesh out this idea of structure and how it relates to incarceration and recidivism, which I'll get into in a little bit. And then finally, I wanted to see if any of the practices that Norway was implementing would be able to be transposed into the US, just sort of looking forward into our future practices with our legal system and our criminal justice system. So why study Norway? The US and Norway are both industrialized countries, but after that, the similarities kind of stop. They have polar opposite incarceration levels. Norway incarcerates about 75 people per 100,000, and on the other hand, the US incarcerates around 707 people per 100,000. They also have different recidivism rates. So Norway has a recidivism rate of 20%, which means that 20% of their released inmates get rearrested. The US has a recidivism rate of 76, which is the highest. So they have such incredibly different levels, which made them really awesome case studies to sort of compare and contrast against each other. And then finally, the way they approach incarceration is from really different perspectives, which meant I was able to go deeper in my analysis than just looking at different intervention methods and really examine the structure of the countries and societies as a whole. So I'll start off with some theories of punishment, which really were able to guide my research. I focused on three main theories. First, the utilitarian theory, which says to increase productivity and decrease crime, which is basically doing the most good for the most people at the lowest economic cost. So underneath the utilitarian theory, you have the retributivist theory and the rehabilitation theory. The retributivist theory states that incarceration is a form of justice, rationalizing prison as something that prisoners deserve because of their crimes. So you did something wrong, you get a punishment. The rehabilitation theory, on the other hand, is the idea that people aren't their worst act, and incarceration should serve as an opportunity to rehabilitate and correct deviant behavior. The utilitarian theory is really complicated, especially in regards to the US. Our prison system is incredibly expensive, costing on average about $31,000 per prisoner per year, which overall adds up to trillions that are spent between state and federal governments based on where prisoners reside, and also based on just the cost of living in different states and different resources. California is uniquely overcrowded, so their costs are a little bit lower because they house prisoners so tightly packed. But when viewing the US prison system through the lens of utilitarianism, it would seem that the US prison doesn't abide, but it's so much more complicated than that. Because what happens is legislators implement policies for rehabilitation without giving them proper funding and resources. And so, as expected, they fail. And this failure allows the current system of expensive, non-rehabilitative incarceration to remain in place because it's been hailed as effective, because essentially the entire rehabilitation structure has been sabotaged, because if you don't give it proper funding, it's not going to work. This allows businesses who profit from like the industrialized prison complex, and businesses who use prisoners as really, really cheap wage to continue to profit, because rehabilitation is viewed as something that can never work because it was never really given a chance. The US system also follows the retributivist theory very closely. A lot of prison systems do. It's just really clear when you look at different tiered structures of sentencing. So petty theft receives a lesser sentence than murder because it seemed to be a less bad crime. And so it would be unjust for them to have the same sentence. So to follow retributivist, it's really just the idea that punishment is just. Norway more closely follows the rehabilitative theory as well as utilitarian. They do also have tiered sentencing, but their sentences are just so incredibly short overall, with an average of like 8 months compared to the US, which is many years. So Norway has exceptional rehabilitation programs that demonstrate the rehabilitative theory. They have a shockingly low rate of recidivism, as I mentioned earlier. What's interesting is they spend significantly more per prisoner, averaging at about what's equivalent of $100,000 US dollars, but they have way fewer prisoners to provide for, because I said earlier, they just don't have as many prisoners per people. This maintains the utilitarian theory because it's ultimately the most good for the most people and the most cost effective, because they view rehabilitation as an investment rather than just another policy. So I'll talk a little bit about the structural approach, which is sort of how I went about my research. I focused on trying to combine multiple risk factors for increased prison population and show how they were all related to each other rather than just focusing on one structural idea. So other risk factors I investigated were pre-prison education, education and programs during prison, and programs available to prisoners post-release. For my thesis, I defined structure as the interactions between institutional, social, and economic foundations of the country. The US has a wildly underfunded in-prison program and post-release program system, which is a gap that's filled in by non-governmental organizations who work on a small scale to help prisoners. Unfortunately, this means that prisoners have access to resources based on the physical location of their prison, as well as the organization's abilities to provide for them, whereas Norway has it's implemented by the federal government. So one major difference I found structurally from the US to Norway was this idea of institutional racism. The US has a history of racism that started before we were even a country, and has continued to present day. This is evident in many things, but one of the things that I looked at was the number of minority students, particularly Black and African American students, who were suspended and expelled compared to white students. In the US education system, Black and African American students make up about 16% of the student population, but 31% of in-school arrests. And this is a pattern that sort of continues in the criminal justice system. So looking at racial disparities, just in prisons, but also in sentencing and parole, and really understanding that minorities are commonly given longer sentences for lesser crimes than white inmates. And so sort of going with that idea of racism carrying through the criminal justice system. Norway, on the other hand, is predominantly white. They have one small ethnic group that I found, which is the Sami. But for the majority, they're one nationality, one race, and one ethnicity. So while there are white supremacists in Norway, they're much less outspoken than those in the US, partially because they don't have this racial mixing. Recently, they've had increased immigration, specifically of refugees, and it's altered the racial makeup of Norway a little bit, but there hasn't really been like an overarching effect that I found among society. For my research, understanding the racial differences between the US and Norway, it really helped me frame alternative approaches to high incarceration and recidivism as effects of institutional racism. I worked around the idea of us versus them, something the US has held on to throughout history. This idea was present in my research because it centered around the concept that people who were incarcerated were fundamentally different from those who were not, and therefore not deserving of resources, of funding, and ultimately of compassion. And so really just how society sort of separates people based on their incarceration and criminal status. So initially my research was really depressing. It's never fun to learn how your country is failing millions of people, but it also gave me a lot of hope because there are solutions that really work. And I wanted to share a few of them. So not everything that Norway does is going to work for the US. Some of our states are bigger than their country. We have a really different political system. You know, we have federal, state, and state prisons, whereas Norway really just has federal prisons. So I'm not saying that you just transpose their solutions exactly, but it's nice to have a model of something that works to sort of look at and understand and investigate. Some of the policies that Norway has, though, might work really well. So Norway has education that's accessible to every prisoner. They give them job skills and they work with them directly to find a job after release. Most prisoners in Norway go to halfway houses to finish up their already very short sentences, which is relatively uncommon in the US. We normally think of halfway houses as transitions for out of like drug rehabilitation and less so out of prison. Normally it's parole, but you can still go back to your home and your neighborhood and your community, which can be really helpful, but can also pose some problems. The halfway houses in Norway are really designed to start assimilating prisoners back to society before they're actually released from supervision. They have a really cool kind of halfway house that's designed for mothers who have children, and it allows the mothers to stay with their kids just under supervision. And it limits the trauma to the children having a parent taken away from them. And these are all solutions that would be possible in the US, which is really exciting. But the thing that we really need to understand is that funding for rehabilitation is an investment. It's not a quick turnaround. It can take years to see actual return on money just because of the length of the sentences we have. So if you are rehabilitating a prisoner with a 20-year sentence, you're not going to start to see a return until they're released and actually integrated into society. And it's one of the reasons that rehabilitation is just so unpopular. The BARD Prison Initiative is an educational program that provides prisoners the opportunity to earn college degrees, and they decreased recidivism among graduates from 76% to 2%. So we know that these things work. It's just implementing them that's really, really difficult. But continuing to fund education for prisoners would save an immense amount of money in the long term just because of the cost of recidivism. But aside from the money and the economic standpoint, investing in incarcerated citizens helps everybody. Communities and families suffer immensely when they lose members to prison. Children are traumatized by losing a parent. They grow up in single-parent households where their remaining parent has to work and has less time to spend with them, which puts them behind in school and behind with their peers. There's less contribution to the economics because these people can't work because they're in prison and they're not released with skills to work. And working to decrease incarceration and recidivism would allow people to return to society, get legal jobs, and ultimately would really allow them to contribute in a meaningful way. So finally, I'd like to share some key takeaways from my research. So first, the US seems to be unable to free itself from its racist past. Without addressing the institutional racism that's affecting our country, addressing the symptoms is just going to be a lot more difficult. I like to think of it sort of like putting a Band-Aid on it, where you can kind of address the symptoms, but you're not really dealing with what's under the Band-Aid and the reason that you needed one to begin with. And so ultimately, excuse me, we're going to need to take a deeper look at our country and sort of the way we work. Next, looking to other countries might provide a way forward. So while the solutions elsewhere may not work exactly in the US, it provides an outline of ideas that are successful and ideas that we can model after. And it means that we don't have to try out everything ourselves if we know that something works for other countries. So we know that education works. We don't have to try and fail a bunch of times because we can model our education practices after other countries that have decreased their recidivism and incarceration rates. Ultimately, changing the policies regarding rehabilitation and incarceration in general will require people to shift the way that they view incarcerated members of society. Norwegian citizens actively speak up for those who are incarcerated, and even victims' families have lobbied for shorter sentences of the perpetrators. And the US really needs to change their perspective and see society as a whole, and view criminals and take responsibility for deviance as a country and a society and a community, rather than just putting the blame on the individuals. So that was all of my research. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much.